On the afternoon of May 15, 1946, a dark green Army staff car pulled into the gravel parking lot of the Desert Rose Motor Inn, a single-story establishment located approximately 3 miles east of downtown El Paso, Texas, and less than 2 miles from the main gate of Fort Bliss. The motel sat along a stretch of Highway 80 that connected El Paso to the vast expanse of West Texas, a route frequented by military personnel, traveling salesmen, and families making their way between California and the eastern states. The building itself consisted of 12 units arranged in an L shape around the parking area, each room accessible from an exterior walkway that ran the length of the structure. A small office occupied the corner position, its window offering a clear view of both the highway and the entrance to the lot. The owner, Robert Chen, a 52-year-old Chinese-American man who had purchased the property in 1940, was standing behind the front desk when the staff car arrived, and he watched through the window as a uniformed Army officer stepped out of the driver's seat and opened the rear doors for 5 men in civilian clothes. The men who emerged from the vehicle appeared to be in their 30s and 40s, dressed in dark suits that looked recently purchased but ill-fitting, as if they had been issued rather than tailored. They stood in a cluster near the car, speaking to each other in low voices, while the Army officer walked toward the office carrying a leather portfolio. Robert had seen military personnel at his establishment many times over the years, Fort Bliss being one of the largest Army installations in the country, but there was something about this particular arrival that struck him as unusual. The men in civilian clothes did not carry luggage. They did not appear comfortable or familiar with each other in the way that traveling colleagues typically did, and they kept glancing around the parking lot and the surrounding area as if uncertain of where they were or what they were supposed to do next. The Army officer entered the office and approached the desk with the efficiency of someone executing a predetermined plan. He introduced himself as Captain William Morrison from the Fort Bliss Administrative Office, and he informed Robert that he needed to arrange accommodations for 5 guests who would be staying for approximately 2 weeks. The request was straightforward, the kind of reservation Robert handled routinely, but the manner in which it was presented carried an unusual formality. Captain Morrison explained that the Army would be covering all expenses, that the bill should be sent directly to a specific office at Fort Bliss, and that the guests were civilian contractors working on technical projects related to military operations. Robert nodded, pulled out 5 registration cards, and asked if the guests would be coming in to complete the paperwork. The captain said he would handle the registration himself, and he proceeded to fill out the cards with names, dates, and minimal identifying information, leaving several fields blank. As Robert processed the paperwork, the 5 men were brought into the office in a group, and Captain Morrison gestured for them to wait near the door while he completed the transaction. Robert handed over 5 room keys, and it was during this exchange that he heard one of the men speak. The language was unmistakably German, a short phrase directed at another member of the group, and the accent was thick and unambiguous. Robert, who had learned German during his years working in import-export businesses before the war, recognized not just the language, but the regional characteristics of the pronunciation. The man who had spoken appeared startled when he realized someone else was present, and he fell silent immediately. But the moment had been sufficient for Robert to understand that these were not American contractors, or, if they were, their origins lay elsewhere. The group was escorted to their rooms by Captain Morrison, and Robert watched from the office window as they disappeared into units 7 through 11. The doors closing one by one until the walkway was empty again and the staff car had departed. Robert returned to his desk and examined the registration cards. The names were clearly American, standard surnames like Miller, Johnson, and Patterson. But something about the handwriting, the way certain letters were formed, suggested that Captain Morrison had copied them from a prepared list rather than inventing them on the spot. Robert placed the cards in his filing system, a metal box where he kept all guest records organized by date, and he made a mental note of the peculiarity, but did not dwell on it extensively at the time. 3 weeks later, on June 8, 1946, the pattern repeated itself with remarkable precision. Another Army staff car arrived in the early afternoon, and another group of men in civilian clothes emerged. This time, 6 individuals rather than 5, but the sequence unfolded in exactly the same manner. An Army officer handled the registration, filled out the cards himself, arranged payment through Fort Bliss administrative channels, and escorted the men to their rooms without allowing them to linger in the office or interact with Robert beyond brief nods of acknowledgement. The resemblance to the previous arrival was too precise to be coincidental, and Robert began to pay closer attention to details he might have otherwise overlooked. He noticed that none of the men carried personal luggage when they first arrived, though military-issued duffel bags were delivered to their rooms later that evening by a separate vehicle. He observed that the registration cards again listed American names, but when he walked past the occupied rooms during his evening rounds, he heard conversations in German, sometimes in what sounded like technical discussions involving terminology he could not fully understand even with his language skills. On June 12th, Robert was cleaning room 9 after one of the groups had checked out, and he found a sheet of paper that had fallen behind the nightstand, apparently dislodged when the occupant had been packing. The paper contained a hand-drawn technical diagram, lines and measurements annotated in German, with what appeared to be cross-sectional views of some kind of cylindrical mechanism. Robert had no engineering background and could not determine what the diagram represented, but the precision of the drawing and the official appearance of the notation suggested it was not casual correspondence. He took the paper to his private office behind the front desk, retrieved his personal camera, a Kodak 35 he had purchased in 1938, and photographed the document against a blank wall where the lighting was consistent. He then returned the paper to room 9, placing it back behind the nightstand where he had found it, reasoning that if someone came looking for it, they would find it exactly where it had been left. Over the following months, Robert developed a systematic approach to documenting what he was observing. He began keeping a separate ledger, distinct from his standard business records, in which he noted the dates of each group's arrival and departure, the number of men in each group, the room numbers they occupied, and any details he could gather from registration cards or overheard conversations. On July 12th, while filing paperwork in his office, Robert examined one of the registration cards more closely and noticed a name that seemed familiar. The card listed a guest as Walter Patterson, but something about the structure of the name, the way it sounded when pronounced, triggered a memory. Robert drove to the El Paso Public Library the following afternoon and requested access to their collection of scientific journals, specifically pre-war German publications related to engineering and physics. He spent 3 hours searching through bound volumes from the late 1930s until he found what he was looking for: an article published in a 1938 journal about rocket propulsion systems, authored by a Dr. Walter Peterson from the Technical University in Berlin. The photograph accompanying the article showed a man in his early 30s, and while 6 years in wartime circumstances would have changed his appearance, Robert recognized enough similarities in the facial structure to convince himself that Walter Patterson and Walter Peterson were very likely the same individual. He copied the relevant pages from the journal, paying the librarian 10 cents for the service, and added them to his private file. Over the next 6 weeks, he repeated this research process, cross-referencing names from registration cards with pre-war German academic publications, and he successfully identified 2 additional matches, both scientists who had published technical papers related to aeronautics and propulsion engineering before 1939. The realization that these men were not merely German speakers but accomplished scientists with documented histories in the Reich's technical establishment transformed Robert's understanding of what was happening at his motel. On August 30th, Robert was restocking coffee supplies in the small dining area adjacent to the office when he overheard a conversation between Captain Morrison, who had returned to check on one of the groups, and a civilian administrator from Fort Bliss. The administrator mentioned something called Project Overcast, a term Robert had never encountered, and he referenced housing arrangements and security protocols that needed to be maintained during the transition period. Robert continued his work without acknowledging that he had heard anything, but later that evening he wrote the term in his ledger and underlined it twice. He attempted to find information about Project Overcast through newspaper archives and library resources, but the term appeared nowhere in public records. The absence of information was itself revealing, suggesting that whatever Project Overcast involved, it was not something the government intended for civilian awareness. By mid-September, Robert had accumulated a substantial collection of evidence. His filing cabinet now contained registration cards, photographs of technical documents, copied pages from German scientific journals, and a detailed timeline that stretched from May through September of 1946. What had begun as casual observation had evolved into something more deliberate, and Robert found himself grappling with questions that extended beyond simple curiosity. These men were German scientists. That much seemed certain, and they were being brought to the United States under false identities with direct Army supervision. The war had ended barely a year earlier, and the implications of former enemy personnel being secretly relocated to American military facilities raised concerns that Robert could not easily dismiss. He had lost cousins during the Japanese occupation of Shanghai, family members who had been caught in the machinery of Axis aggression, and the idea that the United States government was now providing comfortable accommodations and apparent employment to men who had worked for the Nazi regime created a moral discomfort he could not ignore. On October 15th, Robert witnessed an argument in the parking lot between one of the German scientists and Captain Morrison. The exchange was conducted in English, and while Robert could not hear every word from his position near the office window, he caught fragments that suggested disagreement over promises that had been made and assurances that were not being kept. The scientist, a man in his mid-40s who had been staying in room 8 for nearly 3 weeks, gestured emphatically and raised his voice enough that the words security clearances and family members carried across the distance. Captain Morrison responded with a tone that was simultaneously placating and firm, and the conversation ended with both men walking in opposite directions, the scientist returning to his room and the captain driving away in his staff car. The incident reinforced Robert's growing sense that the arrangement he was observing was not entirely voluntary, or at least not proceeding as smoothly as the Army had planned. Robert decided that the information he had compiled needed to reach someone beyond the immediate military chain of command at Fort Bliss. On October 22nd, he contacted Harold Fleming, the editor of the El Paso Herald-Post, a man Robert knew socially through the local Chamber of Commerce. They met for coffee at a diner downtown, and Robert described what he had been observing at his motel, careful to present the facts without speculation or exaggeration. Fleming listened politely, asked a few clarifying questions, and then offered his assessment. Military personnel matters, particularly those involving Fort Bliss operations, were not areas where civilian newspapers typically interfered, especially during a period when national security concerns remained elevated despite the war's conclusion. Fleming suggested that Robert was likely observing some kind of technical assistance program, possibly involving refugee scientists, and that pursuing the matter further would probably result in nothing more than official stonewalling and potential complications for Robert's business relationship with the Army. The conversation left Robert frustrated, but not deterred. On November 3rd, he placed a phone call to the Fort Bliss Civilian Liaison Office, a department responsible for handling interactions between military operations and the local community. He identified himself and explained that he had questions about guests who had been staying at his establishment under Army contracts. The response from the liaison officer was courteous, but entirely unhelpful. Military personnel matters and contractor arrangements were not subject to civilian inquiry, the officer explained, and all questions regarding Army operations should be directed through proper channels, which in this case meant channels that were not accessible to motel owners in El Paso. The phone call ended with Robert receiving a polite thank you for his cooperation, and a reminder that discretion regarding military activities was appreciated by the War Department. Robert spent the next 2 weeks considering his options, aware that he was holding information that might be significant, but uncertain about where to take it, or whether doing so would accomplish anything beyond making his own situation more complicated. The decision point arrived unexpectedly on November 19th when a new guest appeared at the motel without Army escort, a man in his 50s who spoke heavily accented English and appeared visibly distressed. The man checked in using his own money, paying cash for a single night, and he asked Robert if there was somewhere nearby where he could make a private phone call. Robert directed him to a payphone at a gas station 2 blocks away, and the man thanked him and left on foot. He returned an hour later and approached Robert in the office, and what he said during that conversation would fundamentally alter Robert's understanding of what he had been documenting. The man explained in broken English that he had been hired as a translator for one of the German scientist groups, that he was himself a refugee from Poland who had survived internment during the war, and that he had been brought to Fort Bliss to facilitate communication between Army personnel and scientists who spoke limited English. What disturbed him, what had driven him to leave the base without authorization and seek out civilian lodging, was the realization that some of the scientists he was translating for had been directly involved in wartime activities that resulted in the deaths of forced laborers. He did not provide specific names or detailed accusations, but he told Robert that the background investigations being conducted by Army officials were superficial at best, that denazification certificates were being accepted without meaningful verification, and that men with documented Nazi Party membership were being cleared for employment on American military projects. The man's hands shook as he spoke, and he kept glancing toward the parking lot as if expecting someone to arrive. He stayed in his room that night, and when Robert came to check on him the following morning, the room was empty. The bed had been slept in, but all personal belongings were gone, and when Robert called the phone number the man had written on his registration card, a voice on the other end informed him that no one by that name was employed at Fort Bliss. The encounter crystallized Robert's decision. On December 2nd, 1946, he sat down at his desk in the small office behind the motel's front counter and composed a detailed letter addressed to Congressman R. Ewing Thomason, who represented Texas's 16th congressional district, which included El Paso. Robert had voted for Thomason in the previous election and knew him to be a former judge with a reputation for integrity. The letter was 5 pages long, typed on Robert's personal typewriter, and it methodically laid out everything he had observed and documented over the previous 7 months. He included copies of registration cards with German names that corresponded to scientists he had identified through library research. He included photographs of the technical diagrams and documents he had found in guest rooms. He provided a timeline showing the pattern of arrivals and departures, the consistent involvement of Army personnel, and the evidence that false identities were being used. He explained his concerns about inadequate vetting procedures, and the potential presence of individuals with Nazi Party affiliations being granted access to American military facilities and classified projects. He closed the letter by requesting an investigation into what he believed was a program operating without proper oversight or public accountability. Robert mailed the letter on December 4th from the main post office in downtown El Paso, using registered mail to ensure it would be tracked and signed for upon delivery. He received a brief acknowledgment 2 weeks later, a form letter thanking him for his correspondence, and assuring him that his concerns had been forwarded to the appropriate staff members. Then, on December 18th, a more substantive response arrived. Congressman Thomason's office requested that Robert travel to Washington for an in-person meeting to discuss the matters raised in his letter. The meeting was scheduled for January 8, 1947, and travel expenses would be reimbursed through the congressional office. Robert made arrangements for his wife to manage the motel during his absence, and on January 5th he boarded a train at the El Paso station for the 3-day journey to the nation's capital. The meeting took place in Thomason's congressional office on the 3rd floor of the Cannon House office building, a room with tall windows overlooking Independence Avenue and walls lined with law books and framed certificates. Thomason was present along with a senior aide who took notes throughout the conversation, and Robert was asked to present his evidence in whatever manner he felt was most effective. He laid out his documentation on the conference table systematically, beginning with the registration cards and moving through the photographs, the timeline, and the cross-referenced scientific publications. He explained his methodology, his reasons for documenting what he had observed, and his concerns about a program that appeared to be deliberately concealed from public knowledge. Thomason listened carefully, asked pointed questions about specific dates and names, and examined the photographs with particular attention to the technical diagrams Robert had copied. When Robert finished his presentation, Thomason leaned back in his chair and acknowledged that the program Robert had discovered did, in fact, exist, that it was operating under joint authority of the State Department and the War Department, and that its purpose was to recruit German scientists and engineers whose technical expertise was considered valuable. The congressman explained that the program had been initiated in the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender, driven by concerns that Soviet forces were actively recruiting German technical personnel for their own military and scientific programs. The United States government had determined that preventing the Soviet Union from acquiring German rocket scientists, aeronautical engineers, and specialists in advanced weapons systems was a matter of national security that justified extraordinary measures. The scientists being brought to facilities like Fort Bliss represented some of the most accomplished technical minds in fields that would be critical to America's defense posture in what was increasingly being recognized as a new kind of conflict, one defined not by conventional military engagements, but by technological competition and ideological confrontation. Thomason did not dispute Robert's concerns about the vetting procedures or the backgrounds of some of the individuals being recruited. He acknowledged that the program had operated with minimal oversight in its initial phases, and that documentation regarding Nazi Party membership and wartime activities had been incomplete, or in some cases deliberately overlooked in the interest of securing technical knowledge before the Soviets could do the same. Robert pushed back, asking how such a program could be justified when it appeared to contradict the principles for which the war had ostensibly been fought, when men who had worked directly for a regime responsible for atrocities were now being provided with comfortable accommodations and employment by the American government. Thomason's response was measured but firm. He did not defend every aspect of the program's implementation, but he emphasized that the geopolitical reality facing the United States in 1947 required difficult choices, that the alternative of allowing the Soviet Union to monopolize German technical expertise posed unacceptable risks, and that Congress had been informed of the program's existence even if the general public had not. He promised Robert that a formal inquiry would be opened into the vetting procedures and background investigations being conducted by the War Department, that Robert's documentation would be entered into the congressional record under classified procedures, and that efforts would be made to ensure greater oversight of future recruitment activities. He also warned Robert that the information he had gathered touched on matters of national security classification, that discussing the program publicly or sharing his documentation with unauthorized parties could result in legal complications, and that his cooperation with the congressional inquiry would need to be handled with discretion. Robert returned to El Paso on January 14th, carrying with him a receipt acknowledging that his documentation had been submitted to the House Committee on Military Affairs, and a letter from Thomason, thanking him for his diligence and civic responsibility. Over the following weeks, Robert noticed changes in the patterns he had been observing. The frequency of German scientist groups staying at his motel decreased significantly. By March 1947, the Army had ceased using the Desert Rose Motor Inn for housing personnel associated with what Robert now understood was officially called Operation Paperclip, the program having been renamed from its original designation of Operation Overcast several months earlier. Scientists and their families were being relocated to permanent housing facilities constructed on Fort Bliss property, where security could be more easily maintained and where civilian observation would be eliminated. The Army contracts that had provided steady revenue for Robert's business were terminated, and while the official explanation cited administrative reorganization and budget adjustments, Robert understood that his role in bringing congressional attention to the program had made his establishment unsuitable for continued use. In June 1947, Thomason's office sent Robert a brief letter informing him that the congressional inquiry had been completed, that several recommendations regarding enhanced background investigation procedures had been submitted to the War Department, and that new protocols were being implemented to ensure more rigorous vetting of foreign nationals being recruited for sensitive military projects. The letter did not provide details about specific findings or actions taken, and it concluded with a reminder that the matters discussed remained subject to security classification. Robert filed the letter with his other documentation and resumed managing his motel, which now served its original clientele of travelers and occasional military personnel on routine business. The months following his return from Washington settled into a routine that resembled the years before May 1946, though Robert found himself paying attention to news reports about rocket testing at White Sands Proving Ground and technical developments at Fort Bliss, with a perspective informed by what he had witnessed. He maintained his files in a locked cabinet in his office, occasionally adding newspaper clippings about German scientists working on American military projects when such information appeared in public reporting, which was rare. He received periodic updates from Thomason's office, brief letters that acknowledged ongoing oversight of Operation Paperclip, but provided few concrete details about what reforms had been implemented or what scientists had been removed from the program as a result of enhanced vetting procedures. By the early 1950s, the correspondence had ceased entirely, Thomason having retired from Congress in 1947, and Robert was left with his documentation and his memories of a period when his motel had served as an unintentional way station for men whose work would shape the trajectory of the Cold War. The public prominence of former German scientists became impossible to ignore as the decade progressed. In 1950, Robert read a newspaper article about Wernher von Braun, identified as the technical director of the Army's rocket development program at Fort Bliss, and he recognized the name from one of the registration cards he had photographed in 1946, though the card had listed a different name at the time. Articles about America's missile programs and satellite development projects featured quotes from German engineers and scientists who were presented as valuable contributors to national defense, with occasional references to their wartime backgrounds framed in sanitized language, about technical expertise transcending political ideology. Robert saw photographs of these men in magazines and journals, well-dressed and comfortable in their adopted country, and he wondered how many of them had passed through his motel during those months in 1946 when the program was still operating in secrecy. The declassification of Operation Paperclip began in the 1970s, prompted by Freedom of Information Act requests and investigative journalism that exposed details about the program's scope and the backgrounds of scientists who had been recruited. In 1973, Robert was contacted by a reporter from the Washington Post who was researching the program's early implementation and had found references to congressional inquiries conducted in 1947. The reporter had obtained Robert's name from declassified documents in the National Archives, and she drove to El Paso to interview him about his observations and his role in bringing the program to congressional attention. Robert retrieved his files from the cabinet where they had remained largely undisturbed for more than 25 years, and he spent an afternoon walking the reporter through the registration cards, the photographs, the timeline he had constructed, and the copies of scientific journals he had used to identify the men who had stayed at his motel. The reporter took notes and photographs of the documents, and several months later, Robert received a copy of the article that had been published, a detailed investigation into Operation Paperclip's vetting failures, and the extent to which Nazi Party members had been knowingly recruited despite official policies prohibiting such actions. Robert Chen died on March 8, 1984, at the age of 90, having operated the Desert Rose Motor Inn until his retirement in 1978. His children, while sorting through his belongings in the months following his death, found the filing cabinet containing his Operation Paperclip documentation and donated it to the University of Texas at El Paso Archives, where it became part of the historical record used by researchers studying the program's implementation and the civilian oversight that had occasionally interrupted its operations. The documents Robert had compiled, meticulous in their detail and systematic in their organization, provided historians with a ground-level perspective on how Operation Paperclip had functioned in its early phases, corroborating other sources and filling gaps in the official record that had been created by classification and bureaucratic compartmentalization. The Desert Rose Motor Inn continued operating under different ownership through the 1990s, before being converted into a storage facility in 2003. In 2011, the El Paso County Historical Society installed a small plaque near the location, noting that the site had served as temporary housing for German scientists recruited under Operation Paperclip, and acknowledging Robert Chen's role in documenting the program and advocating for congressional oversight. The plaque does not resolve the moral complexities of Operation Paperclip itself. The question of whether the scientific gains achieved through the recruitment of former Nazi personnel justified the compromises made in the process, but it recognizes that ordinary citizens, through careful observation and persistence, can create accountability even when powerful institutions prefer to operate without scrutiny. The motel, where Robert Chen kept his careful records, had witnessed the arrival of men whose technical knowledge would contribute to America's space program and missile defense systems. But it had also documented a moment when democratic principles of transparency collided with Cold War imperatives of secrecy, and when one individual's determination to preserve evidence created a historical record that would outlast the classifications and justifications offered by those who designed the program.